They did not throw me out of the family because of some unforgivable cruelty. They erased me because I chose a man with calloused hands over a polished legacy. At our engagement dinner, my father sneered, he pours concrete for other people's dreams. For 5 long years, I was entirely dead to them. Now, their precious real estate empire is cracking from the inside, and the only door left between them and absolute ruin belongs to me. My name is Allison Beckett. At 33 years of age, I had mastered the art of being exactly what my family required the intelligent, poised, and quietly relentless daughter of Edward and Lorraine Beckett. In the affluent, manicured circles of Ashbrook, Tennessee, my parents were treated like modern royalty. They were the sole owners of Beckett Signature Communities, a high-end residential development company that bought up the lush, rolling hills of the state and replaced them with sprawling, multi-million-dollar estates. To the outside world, we were a portrait of aristocratic Southern success. To those inside the glass walls of the corporate headquarters, it was a different story entirely, and I was the one who read every line of it. I spent years in the trenches of that company, while my older brother, Grant, spent his afternoons playing golf with local politicians and his evenings expensing lavish dinners to the corporate account. I was the one buried in the brutal reality of the business. Grant possessed a reckless, easy charm that won over investors, but he could not read a topography map or a compliance report if his life depended on it. I handled the labyrinthine vendor contracts. I managed the suffocating stacks of compliance files. I orchestrated the permit coordination with hostile county clerks. I knew every zoning law, every contractor by their first name, and every hidden liability in our expansive portfolio. I spent thousands of hours making sure the foundation of our family's wealth did not sink into the mud. I was the engine keeping the machine from tearing itself apart, making me far more competent than the golden heir who simply wore the family name like an expensive watch. Then I met Mason Hale, and the carefully constructed script of my life was torn to shreds. Mason was not the kind of man my parents invited to their charity galas. He was a construction foreman. He was a man who spent his days in the dust and the noise, turning my father's arrogant blueprints into physical reality. Mason was widely respected on the job sites for a rare, unwavering honesty. He possessed a profound calm under immense pressure and held a strict, uncompromising refusal to cut safety corners. The first time we spoke, he was flatly refusing to sign off on a hurried grading report that Grant had tried to push through ahead of a storm season. Mason stared my brother down, his voice steady, and said he would rather walk off the site than build a house on shifting dirt. I was sent down to the site to discipline him. Instead, I stood in the dirt, looked into his steady eyes, and realized I was looking at the first truly honest man I had ever met in Ashbrook. I fell in love with him. It was not a naive, swept-off-my-feet romance. It was a grounded, profound recognition of a true equal. My parents despised the relationship from the very first second they became aware of it. To Edward and Lorraine Beckett, people like Mason were tools to be used, not people to be welcomed to the dining table. Mason was unapologetically blue-collar. He was direct, speaking without the layered, polite deceit that my family relied upon. Worst of all, he was completely impossible to control. My father could not buy him with a promotion, and my mother could not intimidate him with her icy social status, because Mason wanted nothing from their world. They had absolutely no power over him. And to the Becketts, a lack of power was an unforgivable offense. They decided to break us, and they chose to do it on their own territory, designing a trap disguised as a formal engagement dinner. The dinner was held on a Friday evening in late October at the Beckett estate. The grand dining room was a monument to old money and carefully curated intimidation. 4 sweeping crystal chandeliers cast a heavy, warm light over long mahogany tables set for 80 guests. The floral centerpieces alone cost more than what Mason earned in a month of breaking his back in the Tennessee heat. The guest list was a tactical strike the mayor, county judges, wealthy investors, and the absolute elite of Ashbrook society. It was not a celebration. It was a high-pressure intervention meant to humiliate Mason and force me into ending the relationship to save face. Mason sat beside me, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, though I knew he felt suffocated by the room. His hands, resting on the starched white linen tablecloth, were a landscape of small scars and thick calluses. I reached under the table and rested my hand on his knee. He gave me a single, steady nod. Halfway through the second course of roasted duck, my father stood at the head of the room. He tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the room, and absolute silence fell over the 80 guests. Edward Beckett did not look at me. He looked directly down the length of the table at Mason, his eyes flat and entirely devoid of warmth. "We are gathered here to acknowledge my daughter," Edward began, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced authority. "And the man she has brought into our home." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. "A man," Edward continued, raising his glass in a mocking salute, "who pours concrete for other people's dreams because he can't build his own." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Several guests looked down at their plates. Others stared openly, hungry for the carnage. Mason did not flinch. He simply looked back at my father, his expression completely unbothered, as if he were watching a child throw a tantrum. Before the echo of my father's insult could fade, my mother stood up. Lorraine's posture was rigid, her expression carved from ice. She looked directly at me, weaponizing every ounce of her maternal authority in front of the silent audience. "Allison," she said, her voice carrying flawlessly across the expansive room, "you have a choice to make tonight. If you marry this man, you will lose your place in this family. You will lose your financial trust. And you will be permanently stripped of any future role inside Beckett's signature communities. You will walk out of this house with nothing but the clothes on your back, and you will never be welcomed back. Choose your future." It was the ultimate ultimatum, delivered with maximum cruelty. They expected me to break. They expected the crushing weight of public shame and the terrifying prospect of financial ruin to force me to my knees. I looked at my mother, standing tall in her tailored silk. I looked at my father, a man who had never built a single honest thing with his own 2 hands. Then I looked at the dozens of guests, half of them watching in stunned silence, the other half pretending to be utterly fascinated by their wine glasses. I felt a sudden, profound clarity wash over me. The empire they were threatening to take away from me was a prison built on lies. I did not shout. I did not cry. I calmly pushed my heavy oak chair back and stood up. I reached out and took Mason's rough, calloused hand in mine. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice perfectly level. I turned my back on the empire. Mason and I walked out of the grand dining room, our footsteps echoing against the marble floors of the hallway. We walked out the massive front doors, down the sweeping driveway, and left the mansion behind us in the dark. The retaliation was swift and absolute. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I drove to the corporate headquarters. When I swiped my company access card at the glass security gates, the reader flashed a hard, solid red. A security guard I had personally hired 2 years prior stepped in front of me. He looked down at his boots, unable to meet my eyes, and handed me a taped cardboard box containing the few personal items from my desk: a framed photo, my favorite pen, and a coffee mug. My office had been emptied before the sun even rose. By noon, a motorcycle courier arrived at Mason's small apartment where I had spent the night. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope embossed with the seal of the family's primary law firm. Inside was a crisp, legally binding letter confirming that I had been formally cut off. The financial trust established in my name had been dissolved under a morality clause my parents controlled. My equity in the company had been forcefully repurchased at a fraction of its value. I was officially disowned. But the final, twisting knife in my ribs came later that afternoon. I received a quiet phone call from an executive assistant I used to mentor. She was whispering, terrified of being caught. She told me that emergency board meetings had been held all morning. My parents had already called in the corporate attorneys to rewrite the entire succession plan. Every single thing I had built, every division I had stabilized, Every contract I had secured through sheer force of will was gone. They had bypassed me completely. The keys to the entire empire, the billions of dollars in projected revenue, and the absolute control of Beckett's signature communities had just been handed to Grant. They gave my reckless, incompetent brother everything, simply because he was willing to bend his knee, and I had chosen to stand up. We did not have a band. We did not have ice sculptures, a 10-tiered cake, or a photographer trying to capture the perfect golden hour lighting. Exactly 14 days after I walked out of my father's house, Mason and I stood in front of a tired judge at the Rutherford County Courthouse. The room smelled of floor wax, old paper, and stale coffee. My dress was a simple ivory shift I bought off a clearance rack for $85. Mason wore his only dark suit, the collar of his crisp white shirt pressing against the strong line of his neck. Our witnesses were his crew foreman and the foreman's wife, a kind woman who brought a single grocery store bouquet of white roses. It was an event that my mother would have described as a tragic, public humiliation. But as Mason slid a plain gold band onto my finger, looking at me with eyes so entirely certain and grounded, I felt a profound, unshakable weight settle into my bones. It was real. For the first time in my 33 years, my life was not a heavily produced performance. It belonged entirely to me, and it belonged to him. The descent from the Ashbrook elite into the working class was steep, cold, and utterly unforgiving. We rented a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the county line, miles away from the manicured lawns and gated driveways I was used to managing. The water pipes groaned in the walls every time you turned the tap. The linoleum in the small kitchen was peeling at the corners, and the heater rattled violently whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. To keep a roof over our heads, Mason took on punishing shifts. He was out the door by 5 in the morning, spending 10 to 12 hours a day framing houses in the bitter winter wind. I would watch him leave, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he carried a dented steel thermos to his truck. Then, I had to swallow my pride and hit the pavement. The woman who used to manage $50 million in vendor contracts and dictate terms to city planners was now begging small-time builders for hourly bookkeeping gigs. I worked from a wobbly card table set up in our narrow living room, calculating lumber estimates and filing permits for independent roofers and plumbers who paid me $25 an hour. I thought my flawless resume and my legendary work ethic would speak for themselves. But Ashbrook is a remarkably small town for the wealthy. I quickly realized the sudden, deafening silence from my former professional network was not accidental. I called developers I had known for a decade, people who used to send me extravagant gift baskets every Christmas and kiss my cheek at charity galas. Now their assistants placed me on endless holds, or told me their bosses were locked in meetings, always in meetings. My father's shadow was incredibly long. I understood that Edward Beckett was quietly sending a brutal message across the county. Anyone who threw his exiled daughter a lifeline would permanently lose their lucrative spot at the Beckett Company trough. Then came the whispers. You cannot keep a secret in our social circles, and high society abhors a vacuum. So my mother made sure to fill the silence with her own narrative. The rumors bled out from the country club dining rooms and filtered down through the county lines. According to the whispers, Allison Beckett did not leave her family for love. She was mentally unstable. She was deeply difficult to work with and had suffered a quiet nervous breakdown. The most vicious rumor claimed I was secretly desperate, heavily in debt, and forced into a reckless marriage with a laborer just to escape my own failures. They painted me as a hysterical woman who threw her brilliant mind away, framing my sudden absence not as a punishment from cruel parents, but as a necessary quarantine for a sick daughter. On the nights I sat at that wobbly card table, staring at unpaid electric bills, and feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of everything I had lost, Mason was my absolute anchor. He never offered me empty platitudes. He would come home covered in sawdust and dried drywall mud, his hands bleeding from the biting cold, and he would just sit beside me on the second-hand sofa. He never told me to look on the bright side. Most importantly, he never once suggested I call my parents, apologize, and be the bigger person. They meant to break your legs, he told me one night, rubbing his rough thumb over my strained knuckles. You do not have to forgive the people who are still holding the bat. He treated my grief and my fury as entirely justified. He listened to me vent. He held me when I cried out of sheer exhaustion, and he never made me feel small for mourning a life he himself despised. Through his steady, uncompromising presence, the heavy fog of my old life began to lift. I started to see my past in Ashbrook for what it truly was. Every polite smile at those galas, every handshake at the country club, every custom-tailored suit was nothing more than a carefully constructed defense mechanism. My parents' empire was built entirely on appearances, obsessive control, and a paralyzing fear of public shame. Mason and I had virtually no money, but we also had no masks left to wear. The true turning point, the moment my defensive grief curdled into something sharp and deeply dangerous, came on a rainy Tuesday in late November. We were sitting in the living room, eating cheap takeout from paper cartons. Mason was looking over some old, folded blueprints he had kept in his truck from his time at Beckett Signature Communities. I leaned over his shoulder and recognized the project name immediately: Oak Ridge Overlook, a massive hillside development Grant had aggressively pushed through 3 years ago. Mason traced a thick, calloused finger over the topographic lines of the eastern slope. He told me the dirt was wrong. He had run the grading crews back then, and he had explicitly warned my father and Grant that the soil compaction on that specific hillside was dangerously inadequate. He told them that if they did not spend the extra money to drive deep steel pilings and stabilize the bedrock, a heavy storm season would eventually cause the retaining walls to fail, taking the luxury homes down the hill with them. My father had smiled, patted Mason on the shoulder, and told him the corporate engineers had it handled. 2 days later, Mason was permanently reassigned to a flatland project on the other side of the county, and his formal safety objections miraculously vanished from the official site logs. Hearing that story flipped a cold, metallic switch in my brain. The sheer arrogance of burying a severe structural risk just to save a few weeks on a schedule and protect a quarterly profit margin was vintage Edward Beckett. But if my father erased Mason's warning, what else had he erased? I had spent my entire adult life swimming in the deep end of the company's corrupt bureaucracy. I possessed a near photographic memory for discrepancies, missing files, and delayed audits. I grabbed a cheap spiral notebook from my desk and a blue pen. I began writing. I started pulling every ghost of a memory from my years inside the corporate office. I mapped out the vendor patterns, noting which shell companies always won the bids for our environmental soil testing. I listed the missing compliance reports Grant had claimed were lost in the mail during the Valley expansion 2 years ago. I documented the rushed land transfers, the specific county inspectors who always seemed to sign off on our projects without ever stepping out of their trucks, and the exact dates my father had ordered me to shred internal emails regarding water runoff liabilities. I did not have the physical files. I was permanently locked out of the company servers, but I had the roadmap locked inside my head, and I started building a comprehensive, obsessively organized ledger of their sins. I spent hours every single night compiling this information, cross-referencing dates with public county records I could access online. I did not know exactly how I was going to use it. I only knew that you cannot fight a war without ammunition, and I was quietly, meticulously stocking the armory. The Becketts thought they had buried me alive. They thought stripping away my title, draining my trust fund, and taking my corporate credit cards would render me entirely helpless. They assumed I would wither and die outside the reinforced walls of their castle. But starvation does a funny thing to a person. It burns away the soft fat of privilege and leaves only the hard, unforgiving muscle underneath. In that cramped, freezing apartment on the edge of nowhere, Mason and I were not breaking. We were adapting. We were learning how to survive without a safety net, which meant we were learning how to fight without any rules. As the harsh months dragged on, we were becoming something infinitely more practical, deeply hardened, and far more dangerous than my parents could ever comprehend. The spring of our second year in exile brought a devastating storm system that broke the county wide open. It began in late April, with straight-line winds clocked at over 80 miles per hour, followed by a week of relentless, driving rain that saturated the ground and overwhelmed the drainage infrastructure. Trees older than the town itself were violently uprooted, crushing roofs, shattering sunrooms, and flattening entire garages across Ashbrook and the surrounding working-class suburbs. When the skies finally cleared, the region looked like a disaster zone, and the waiting game began. The major insurance carriers were immediately paralyzed. Desperate families were told it would take up to 6 months just to get an adjuster out to look at their collapsed ceilings. Predatory, out-of-state contractors flooded the area like vultures, demanding upfront deposits of $10,000 or more before disappearing entirely. Mason could not stand by and watch his neighbors get bled dry while they slept under leaking blue tarps. He started working 12-hour shifts at his regular framing job, and then he would spend his evenings and weekends patching roofs and bracing compromised load-bearing walls for people in our area, charging them absolutely nothing beyond the raw cost of lumber and shingles. But the sheer volume of need was a tidal wave. For every damaged house Mason secured, 5 more frantic families knocked on our apartment door begging for help. Sitting at my wobbly card table, looking at the chaotic stack of hardware store receipts Mason had accumulated, I saw the undeniable path forward. I realized we did not need to wait for the local industry to forgive us. We could build our own door and walk right through it. I took the last $800 we had in our depleted savings account, marched down to the county clerk's office, and filed the incorporation paperwork. We named it Blue Haven Rebuild. What began as an exhausting side hustle slowly, painfully morphed into a legitimate company. It was a modest repair and restoration firm, but we built it on a foundation of absolute, uncompromising integrity. I transformed from a corporate exile into a ruthless administrative machine. I was no longer just the pampered daughter in the corner office managing $50 million portfolios. I was in the trenches. I handled every single municipal permit, personally hunting down evasive city inspectors and reciting the municipal building code back to them until they signed the approvals. I managed the grueling daily schedules, tracked every penny of our financial controls, and became the direct line of communication for homeowners who were terrified of losing their life savings. I proved to the city, and more importantly to myself, that my competence was never tied to the Beckett name. Out in the field, Mason was the undeniable heart of the operation. He led our growing crews with a quiet, magnetic authority. The men who worked for him displayed an intense, fierce loyalty, because Mason did the exact opposite of what my father's subcontractors did. He paid his crew $30 an hour instead of minimum wage. He strictly enforced safety harnesses on steep pitches, and he fiercely protected his workers from abusive, impatient clients. Most importantly, Mason never hid a single defect from a homeowner. If he opened up a wall to fix a simple leak and found extensive black mold rotting the structural supports, he did not patch over it to stay on schedule. He walked the client into the room, showed them the damage, and gave them an honest, painfully realistic estimate of what it would take to make their home safe to live in. Our reputation spread through the county like wildfire, precisely because our entire business model was the antithesis of Beckett's signature communities. We offered fewer empty promises, we delivered vastly superior craftsmanship, and we absolutely refused to sell polished lies. We did not chase the prestige projects, the glossy country club renovations, or the bloated municipal contracts. We spent 3 grueling years living incredibly carefully, driving the same battered heavy-duty pickup truck, wearing boots until the soles wore completely through, and reinvesting every single dollar of profit back into the business. We focused entirely on helping ordinary people put their lives back together. During those hard, transformative years, my world was small, tight, and fiercely guarded. I spoke to almost no one from my past, with one vital exception. I maintained a quiet, gentle bond with my widowed grandmother, Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn was my mother's mother, a woman who possessed a fortune of her own, but zero tolerance for the pretentious, hollow theater of Ashbrook High Society. She was the only relative who never once condemned my marriage or treated Mason like an infection. Every few months, we would meet at a small, unassuming botanical garden on the far east side of the county, far away from the country club crowds. We would sit on a wrought iron bench under the blooming magnolias, sharing a thermos of hot black tea. Evelyn was sharp, observant, and deeply tired of the empire my parents had built. Edward builds neighborhoods exactly the way he builds his relationships. Evelyn told me one crisp autumn afternoon, her frail, paper-thin hands wrapped warmly around her ceramic cup. He makes them look spectacular from the street, but they are completely hollow inside. He is obsessed with expanding his borders, but he has no interest in maintaining the foundation. She despised Grant even more, viewing my brother as a reckless liability who inherited Edward's arrogance but none of his cunning. She knew all about Grant's insatiable appetite for taking dangerous shortcuts to inflate his quarterly bonuses. Evelyn would listen intently as I described the honest, grinding work Mason and I were doing with Blue Haven Rebuild. I could see a profound, quiet pride settling in her eyes. She never pressured me to reconcile with my mother. Instead, she offered vague, heavy assurances that made me realize she was playing a completely different game than the rest of the family. "I have watched them erase you, Allison," she murmured, during our last meeting before her health began to rapidly decline. "And I have long distrusted what your father plans to do with those hillsides out by the valley. You just keep building your honest little company. I have made certain arrangements. Things you do not need to concern yourself with right now, but things that will ensure they can never completely wash their hands of you." She never fully revealed what those arrangements were, and I was too focused on surviving the week to press her for details. I simply assumed she meant a small, secret inheritance she was keeping safe from my mother's attorneys. I had absolutely no idea the monumental weapon she was quietly forging for me. By the beginning of our 4th year in business, the tide finally turned. Blue Haven Rebuild hit a crucial milestone. We had 0 outstanding debt, a fully paid-off fleet of 4 work trucks, and enough cash reserves to guarantee payroll for 6 months even if we never booked another job. We were finally, undeniably secure. We had built a fortress with our own bare hands. It was on a humid Tuesday morning, right as I was closing the books on our most profitable quarter to date, that I saw the billboard go up on Interstate 40. It was a massive, sweeping advertisement, glowing with digitally enhanced sunsets and polished corporate promises. It announced that Beckett Signature Communities was breaking ground on their most ambitious, aggressive luxury development in the history of the company. They were calling it Crown Vale Preserve, a sprawling, multi-million-dollar residential fortress carved directly into the steep, treacherous hillsides of the Eastern Ridge. My family was reaching for their ultimate crown, completely unaware that the foundation beneath them was already rigged to blow. The wind howling off the Eastern Ridge carried the bitter, biting chill of late November. We had moved into a renovated farmhouse on the outskirts of the county a year prior. A quiet sanctuary we had restored with our own hands, far removed from the manicured, suffocating estates of my past. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the soapstone counters after dinner, when the heavy brass knocker on our front door sounded twice. It was past 7 o'clock in the evening. Mason was out in the detached workshop, running a table saw, so I wiped my hands on a towel and answered the door myself. A private courier stood on the porch, his shoulders hunched against the freezing wind. He did not ask for my signature. He simply handed me a thick, oversized black envelope, turned on his heel, and walked back to an idling black sedan. I closed the door and stood in the warmth of the hallway, staring down at my hands. The heavy matte paper was cold to the touch. Pressed firmly into the center of the envelope was a raised, glossy seal. It was the Beckett family crest. I had not seen that interlocking design in years, not since the morning my office was cleared out and my name was scrubbed from the corporate directory. My pulse immediately began to hammer a heavy, irregular rhythm against my throat. I walked slowly back to the kitchen island and carefully broke the seal. Inside, resting on top, was a beautifully printed card on heavy cream cardstock. The looping, Elegant typography requested my presence at a private family reconciliation dinner to be held at the main estate the following Friday at 8 o'clock in the evening. Attached to the formal invitation by a silver paperclip was a piece of personalized stationery. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my mother's sweeping, immaculate script. The note read, "Allison, we have let pride dictate our lives for far too long. The silence between us has been a heavy burden on your father and me. Life is simply too short for old wounds to dictate the future. Please come home for dinner, just the four of us. We want to see our daughter again." I stood frozen under the warm glow of the kitchen pendant lights. Against every single rational instinct, against the armor I had spent years forging in the cold, I felt a dangerous, terrifying flicker of hope ignite in my chest. The rational part of my brain screamed that Lorraine Beckett did not do vulnerability. But the bruised, buried part of me, the daughter who had been ruthlessly discarded, wondered if the sheer weight of time had finally broken them down. Perhaps the isolation had finally forced them to look at what they had done. Perhaps they actually regretted throwing me away. I felt a sudden, humiliating tightness in my throat and a stinging heat behind my eyes. The heavy back door swung open, bringing in a gust of freezing air and the sharp scent of cut pine. Mason stepped into the mudroom, kicking off his heavy work boots. He walked into the kitchen, wiping sawdust from his hands, and stopped dead when he saw my face. He did not ask what was wrong. His eyes immediately dropped to the black envelope and the cream-colored card resting on the soapstone counter. He walked over, his expression carefully neutral, and read my mother's handwritten note. He did not scoff, nor did he tell me it was a lie. He simply observed my trembling hands and the dangerous, fragile hope warring in my eyes. Then, Mason reached out and picked up the heavy black envelope I had carelessly tossed aside. He turned it over in his large, calloused hands. He pinched the edges, his brow furrowing slightly. "Allison," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The envelope is still heavy." He reached his thick fingers deep into the dark interior and pulled out a second, tightly folded packet. It had been wedged perfectly flat against the reinforced cardboard backing, completely hidden in the shadows of the dark paper. Clearly meant to be discovered only after the sentimental trap of the invitation had been sprung. Mason dropped the heavy packet onto the counter. It landed with a dull, sickening thud. It was printed on thick, watermarked legal paper. Poking out from the pristine white edges were 3 bright yellow adhesive tabs. I stared at the bright yellow tabs. Printed in bold black ink on each one was the phrase, "Sign here." Below the phrase, pre-printed in my father's preferred corporate font, were my initials. The fragile flicker of hope inside my chest instantly suffocated, replaced by a cold, rising dread. Mason looked at me, his eyes dark with a quiet, protective fury. This was never about reconciliation. My mother's sentimental note was nothing but a calculated dose of anesthesia meant to numb me before the surgical strike. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in a leather chair inside the law offices of Naomi Voss. Naomi was a fierce, brilliant real estate attorney who operated out of a converted brick warehouse in the commercial district. She had helped me navigate the municipal zoning laws when we first incorporated Blue Haven Rebuild, and she possessed a terrifying ability to strip the emotion out of any legal threat. I slid the folded legal packet across her glass desk. I did not say a word. Naomi picked up the document, pushed her heavy, dark-rimmed glasses up the bridge of her nose, and began to read. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the sharp ticking of a wall clock and the crisp turning of heavy paper. As she read, her jaw tightened, and a sharp crease formed between her eyebrows. "This is not a peace offering, Allison," Naomi finally said, dropping the packet back onto the glass desk. "This is an ambush dressed up as a dinner party. This document is a permanent transfer of access rights and a broad-spectrum development easement. If you sign this without modification, you are irrevocably surrendering your property rights to Beckett's signature communities." I stared at her, completely stunned. I shook my head, my mind racing to make sense of the legal jargon. "That makes absolutely no sense, Naomi," I replied. my voice echoing slightly in the large office. "Mason and I own the farmhouse, and we lease a small commercial yard for the company trucks. Neither of those properties are anywhere near their development zones. We do not own any land that my father could possibly want." Naomi frowned, her eyes scanning the specific parcel coordinates listed on the third page of the document. She turned toward her large computer monitor and rapidly typed the geographic coordinates into the county parcel database. A highly detailed topographic map filled the screen. She turned the monitor so I could see it. On the screen was a massive, highlighted green zone covering hundreds of acres. It was labeled Crown Vale Preserve, my family's new, multi-million-dollar luxury development. "Look right here," Naomi said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the glass screen. Cutting directly through the center of the eastern slope, severing the proposed upper luxury lots from the only viable main access road below, was a jagged, narrow red strip. This red line represents a very specific, narrow strip of ridgeland and a critical stormwater access corridor, Naomi explained, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute clinical precision. Without this exact piece of land, they cannot legally route their heavy construction equipment up the hill, and they absolutely cannot install the massive drainage pipes required to stabilize the upper lots. It is the geographic choke point of their entire development. "Okay," I breathed, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "But my father owns that mountain. He bought out all the neighboring parcels 3 years ago." "No, he did not," Naomi said softly. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she initiated a deep title search on that specific red strip. Lines of green data scrolled across her screen until a certified deed record appeared. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the name on the official county record. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and deep professional respect. "Allison," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The deed to this ridgeland and the stormwater corridor is not held by Beckett's signature communities. It was quietly severed from the main parcel and deeded over through a private, blind trust over 4 years ago. The sole grantor was Evelyn Mercer." My breath hitched violently in my throat. I grabbed the edge of the glass desk, feeling the room tilt beneath me. My grandmother, the quiet assurances on the park bench, the secret arrangements she told me not to worry about. "Who is the grantee?" I asked, though my blood was already roaring in my ears with the answer. "You are," Naomi confirmed, turning the screen fully toward me. "Evelyn deeded this land entirely to you, Allison Beckett. You are the sole, uncontested legal owner of the exact piece of dirt your father needs to build his crown jewel." I sat back in the leather chair as the crushing, monumental truth finally settled over me. The dread evaporated, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. My parents did not send that invitation because they loved me. They did not want their daughter back. They came crawling back because the survival of their entire empire, the billions of dollars tied up in Crown Vale Preserve, now depended entirely on a piece of paper that only I had the legal power to sign. For the next 48 hours, Naomi and I turned her glass-walled conference room into a bunker. We ordered takeout, drank stale coffee, and dissected the public filings for Crown Vale Preserve page by agonizing page. We found the discrepancy buried in a supplemental engineering addendum filed just 3 weeks prior. The original blueprints submitted to the county had classified the eastern slope as stable bedrock. That was the foundational premise upon which my father had secured his massive construction loans, but the new, quietly filed addendum revealed a much darker truth. The mountain was not solid rock. It was composed of fractured shale and highly volatile clay. To keep the multi-million-dollar luxury lots from literally sliding off the mountain, the engineers desperately needed to install a massive, subterranean stormwater diversion system. And the absolutely only viable geographical path for that volume of water ran straight down the narrow ridge parcel my grandmother had legally bound to my name. Naomi pulled the financial liens and spread them across the glass table. "It is a house of cards, Allison," she told me, tapping a silver pen against a thick stack of bank records. "The primary lenders have frozen the capital. They are demanding an emergency restructuring plan. If they do not see a signed easement from you guaranteeing that drainage corridor, they will not release the funds. Furthermore, the county inspectors will red tag the entire site by the end of the month. I took the heavily redacted site reports back to the farmhouse. Mason spread them out over our kitchen island under the warm pendant lights. He did not need a law degree to read the story written in the grading schedules. He traced his rough thumb over the specific dates the excavation crews had been pushed to double their shifts. They hit the bad soil long before they filed this addendum, Mason said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. Look at the equipment rental logs right here. You do not bring in deep soil stabilizers in August if you think you are digging into solid rock. They knew the mountain was unstable, and they kept digging anyway. We did not have to wait long for the definitive proof. 2 nights later, Mason's cell phone rang. The caller ID was blocked, but the man on the other end had a voice Mason recognized instantly. It was a veteran site superintendent named Carter, a man who had been publicly fired by my brother just 1 month ago, allegedly for poor performance. Carter sounded exhausted, his voice thick with the kind of crushing stress that keeps a man awake for days. "Mason," Carter rasped over the speakerphone, "I heard you and your wife are looking at the Crown Vale dirt. You need to know what Grant did." Carter confirmed our absolute worst suspicions. Right before a critical tour with the primary institutional investors from New York, the excavation crews had uncovered massive, jagged fissures in the shale. The slope was already beginning to slip. Carter had immediately ordered a work stoppage and demanded an emergency geological survey. Grant drove his luxury SUV right onto the active grade, Carter explained, the anger vibrating through the phone speaker. He told me that if I halted the project, the investors would walk. He ordered my crew to backfill the fissures with loose dirt, cover them with grading tarps, and keep our mouths shut. When I refused to sign off on the daily safety log, he fired me on the spot and threatened to blacklist me across the entire state. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the scarred wood. I pulled out the cheap spiral notebook I had been meticulously filling for years, the mental ledger of my family's sins. Mason's old warnings from the Oak Ridge project were not a localized failure. Carter's firing was not a one-off mistake by a reckless heir. This was the absolute core of the Beckett family business model. Edward and Grant systematically buried warnings, silenced professionals, and built massive illusions on top of collapsing dirt. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come. The next morning, Naomi called me back to her office. She had overlaid the Crown Vale topographical map with the county residential grid. She did not say a single word when I walked in. She simply pointed to the bottom of her large computer monitor. Directly below the precarious, unstable slope of my father's new luxury development sat an older working-class subdivision built in the 1990s. It was a dense grid of modest ranch homes, chain-link fences, and neighborhood playgrounds. 72 houses, Naomi said softly, all the color draining from her face. If they keep building up top without your drainage corridor, and that slope gives way during the heavy spring storm season, the mud and the runoff will not hit the country club. It will wipe this entire neighborhood off the map. Hundreds of innocent people. Allison. While I was looking at maps of potential devastation, my mother was waging a completely different kind of war. Lorraine Beckett had always treated high society like a chessboard, and she was already aggressively moving her pieces. I received a hesitant phone call from a woman I used to volunteer with at the local library. She felt terrible, but she thought I needed to know what was being said at the prestigious downtown church my parents attended. My mother was holding court at Sunday luncheons and charity board meetings, wearing her finest cashmere and playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch. She was quietly, viciously planting a new narrative. She told the politicians' wives and the bank executives that her daughter was holding a vital community development hostage. She whispered that I was so consumed by petty, bitter jealousy over my brother's success that I was deliberately sabotaging the family business out of spite. She painted herself as a tragic figure, begging for peace, while framing me as a vindictive extortionist. She was systematically turning the entire city against me before I even stepped into the arena. I hung up the phone and walked over to the large bay window in Naomi's office. Looking out at the gray, overcast skyline of the city my family thought they owned, everything suddenly snapped into a terrifying, crystalline focus. My father was not just desperate to save a flagship luxury project. The frozen loan was a lit match held dangerously close to a powder keg. If Crown Vale Preserve failed, the lenders would demand a total forensic audit of Beckett's signature communities. An audit would expose the falsified compliance reports, the buried safety warnings, and the fraudulent engineering data Grant had used to secure the money. Edward Beckett was not looking at a mere corporate bankruptcy. He was looking at catastrophic civil liability, total public ruin, and very likely a federal prison sentence for wire fraud. They did not just need my land, they needed my absolute legitimacy. If I signed that legal packet, my pristine reputation and my legal authority over that crucial parcel would act as a permanent shield for their corruption. My signature would legitimize a rescue package built entirely on hidden fraud. It would signal to the lenders that the project was safe and the family was unified. They wanted me to become an active accomplice in a massive cover-up that threatened the lives of 72 innocent families sleeping at the bottom of a crumbling mountain. The polished invitation to dinner was not a request for mercy. It was a demand for my complicity. And they were about to find out exactly what happens when you hand a loaded weapon to the daughter you threw away. I pulled up to the towering, wrought-iron gates of the estate right at 8 o'clock on Friday evening. Mason sat in the passenger seat of our truck, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He knew absolutely everything. He had spent the previous 2 nights helping me rehearse this very moment in our farmhouse kitchen, until my hands stopped shaking and my voice found its steel. 2 blocks down the road, idling quietly under a broken street lamp, Naomi sat in her sedan with a thermos of black coffee and a direct, open line to my cell phone. I was walking into the lion's den, but I was not walking in blind. The heavy oak front doors were opened by a senior housekeeper who had known me since I was a child. She gave me a tight, nervous nod, her eyes darting away quickly. We stepped into the grand foyer, and the familiar scent of lemon oil, expensive cedar, and burning wax immediately hit the back of my throat, threatening to drag me back into the subservient role I had played for over 3 decades. My parents had staged the formal living room like a theatrical set, designed specifically to break my heart. A fire cracked warmly in the massive stone hearth, casting a golden glow across the Persian rugs. Soft, instrumental jazz drifted from hidden, high-fidelity speakers. On the mahogany credenza, catching the warm light of the table lamps, were 3 silver-framed photographs that had absolutely not been there 5 years ago. They were pictures of me, one from my college graduation, one of me riding horses with my father, and one of Lorraine adjusting my collar at a charity gala. It was a suffocating, deeply calculated display of manufactured nostalgia. It did not feel like a homecoming. It felt exactly like an ambush arranged by people who were terrifyingly accustomed to winning. Edward Beckett stood by the wet bar, unstopping a bottle of dark, incredibly expensive red wine. Lorraine sat perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a soft cream cashmere sweater. Grant lounged aggressively in a leather armchair, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber scotch resting casually on his knee. "Allison," my father said, his voice entirely smooth, polished, and stripped of the hostility that had marked our last, brutal encounter. He walked over, extending a crystal goblet of wine toward me. "It is good to see you in this house again." I did not take the glass. I stood next to Mason, my hands resting loosely at my sides, refusing to accept the prop he was offering. "Let us not pretend this is a social call," I replied, my voice steady and completely flat. Edward offered a tight, patronizing smile, the kind he reserved for stubborn city planners. He placed the wine on a side table and sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if he were carrying the agonizing weight of the world. "The last several years have been a difficult chapter," he murmured, projecting an aura of weary wisdom. "It was a chaotic time, and the transition was painful for everyone. I stared at him, letting his words hang in the air. Painful for everyone. He spoke as if a sudden, unpredictable weather event had separated us, completely ignoring the absolute fact that he was the one who had locked the corporate doors, drained my bank accounts, and explicitly ordered his security guards to escort me off the premises. There was not a single syllable of an apology. He was refusing to take ownership of the knife he had plunged into my back. Lorraine leaned forward, perfectly cueing her entrance into the performance. Her eyes were bright, shimmering with a highly practiced approximation of maternal grief. "Allison, darling," she whispered, her voice laced with a soft, pleading vibrato. "We have all made choices we have to live with. But at the end of the day, family blood should matter more than this stubborn pride. You have proven your point. Now it is time to put the past away and come back to where you belong." I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over my stomach. She was weaponizing the very concept of motherhood against me. She was using the sacred idea of family blood to manipulate me, conveniently forgetting that she was the exact person who had eagerly severed that bloodline the moment I chose a man she could not control. Grant let out a loud, theatrical snort from his armchair. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes sweeping up and down Mason's frame. Mason was wearing a clean, dark blazer over a crisp, button-down shirt, projecting a quiet, immovable dignity that my brother could never hope to purchase. "Labor in a blazer," Grant sneered, his lips curling into a smug, arrogant smile. "It is a cute look. Hale, it really is. But let us be brutally honest here. Are you quite done playing contractor in the mud? Allison, has the temporary little rebellion finally run its course because the adults have real, multi-million-dollar business to conduct, and you are holding up the line?" Mason did not blink. He did not tighten his fists, nor did he rise to the bait. He simply looked at Grant with the absolute, profound indifference of a man watching a minor pest crawl across the floorboards. Edward shot Grant a sharp, warning glare, then turned his full predatory attention back to me. The fragile facade of the loving father evaporated instantly, replaced by the ruthless corporate chairman I recognized all too well. He walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up the familiar, thick legal packet. He tossed it back onto the surface. It landed with a heavy smack that echoed over the soft jazz. "Enough theater," Edward commanded, his voice hardening into a blunt weapon. "We are in a temporary bind, and you possess something I require to move forward. I am prepared to reinstate your trust fund retroactively and offer you a quiet, highly compensated advisory role within the company. In exchange, I want exactly 3 things tonight. First, your immediate signature on that easement. Second, a drafted public statement released tomorrow morning expressing your unwavering support for the family business. And third, your absolute permanent silence regarding any archaic company records you think you might misremember from your time in the office." He stood tall, crossing his arms over his broad chest, fully expecting me to yield to the overwhelming, crushing pressure of his authority, just as I had when I was 20 years old. I walked slowly toward the coffee table. I looked down at the documents, at the bright yellow tabs demanding my absolute obedience. Then, I looked up and met my father's eyes. "You are not in a temporary bind," I said softly, the silence in the room suddenly amplifying my words. "You are in a catastrophic freefall. The primary lenders have frozen your capital because they know the eastern slope of Crown Vale Preserve is built entirely on fractured shale and highly volatile clay. The county inspectors are preparing to red tag the site by the end of the month. You desperately need my drainage corridor because without it, your entire luxury expansion will slide off the mountain and crush 72 working-class homes at the bottom." The color instantly drained from Lorraine's perfectly made-up face. Grant gripped his scotch glass so tightly, I thought the thick crystal might shatter and slice his hand open. "And you think you can just summon me here and force me to sign away my land?" I continued, my voice gaining a terrible, cold momentum. "But it was never your land to leverage. Grandmother knew exactly what you were. She saw the deep, systemic rot inside your empire. Evelyn deeded that specific ridge to me on purpose, because she knew that one day, your blinding greed would outpace your engineering, and I would be the only person capable of stopping you. That crazy old woman had absolutely no right, Edward roared, his composure finally, violently shattering. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched collar. He slammed his fist down hard on the back of the velvet sofa. You think you understand the complex math of this business. You think you are a strategist? I bought that mountain fully aware that the eastern ridge was a catastrophic liability. I knew the soil was garbage 3 years ago. I had the financial risk perfectly managed and buried before your idiot brother rushed the excavation schedules and cracked the bedrock just to impress the New York investors. The room went dead silent. The jazz music seemed to fade into nothing. The only sound was the sharp crackle of the fire in the hearth. Grant stared at his father, his mouth slightly open, the sickening arrogance completely wiped from his face. Edward had just confessed. In his blind, raging desperation to prove he was still the smartest man in the room, he had just admitted the absolute worst truth. He knew about the fatal grading risk long before Carter, the fired superintendent, had ever blown the whistle. Edward had knowingly purchased a volatile mountain and engineered a massive, life-threatening fraud from the very beginning. I looked at my father. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, suddenly realizing exactly what he had just blurted out in front of Mason and me. The invincible, untouchable chairman of Beckett's Signature Communities suddenly looked remarkably small, entirely cornered by his own monumental hubris. I reached down and picked up the heavy silver pen resting next to the legal packet. For a fraction of a second, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of triumph flashed in my mother's eyes. She actually thought I was going to surrender. I turned the pen over in my hand, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Then, I gently laid it back down on top of the blank signature line. I squared my shoulders and looked directly at the three of them, memorizing the look of total defeat settling over their features. You did not invite me here because you wanted to heal our family, I stated, my voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings with absolute crushing finality. You did not invite me here to ask for my forgiveness. You invited me here because you are terrified, and you need me to protect you from the consequences of your own fraud. I reached out and took Mason's arm. He stood tall, an impenetrable wall of quiet, devastating strength right beside me. I am not signing your easement, I told my father, watching the absolute ruin take root in his eyes. I am not releasing a statement of support, and I am entirely out of mercy. I turned my back on the lavish room, the fake photographs, and the family that had thrown me away. Mason and I walked out of the mansion, leaving the unsigned documents on the glass table and the Beckett empire burning to the ground behind us. Exactly 96 hours after I walked out of the estate, the Beckett war machine woke up and unleashed a coordinated, devastating counterattack. My father did not waste time with angry phone calls or empty threats. He sent a squad of process servers to our renovated farmhouse, to Naomi's downtown office, and straight into the Blue Haven yard. We were hit simultaneously with an emergency civil action filed in the county superior court. Edward was formally challenging the legality of Evelyn's deed transfer, aggressively petitioning a judge for an immediate injunction to freeze my control of the land. His high-priced, incredibly aggressive litigators built their entire legal framework on two vicious, fabricated accusations: undue influence and emotional manipulation. They explicitly claimed that I had preyed upon a lonely, deeply confused elderly woman. The legal filings painted a picture of me coercing my grandmother into signing away a critical corporate asset while she was allegedly suffering from undocumented, early-stage cognitive decline. While Edward attacked my legal standing in the courtroom, my mother and brother went straight for my throat in the public square. Lorraine mobilized her extensive social network with the terrifying precision of a military general. Within a matter of days, a deeply toxic, carefully manufactured story began saturating the country club dining rooms, the charity board meetings, and the upscale boutiques of Ashbrook. According to my mother's tearful, whispered narrative, Mason was a calculating, dangerous predator who had systematically isolated me from my loving family so he could slowly seize control of my eventual inheritance. She painted herself as the heartbroken, desperate victim trying to save her brainwashed daughter from a manipulative blue-collar grifter. Grant took the smear campaign a step further. He deliberately circumvented the society gossip and went directly to the local financial press. He leaked a highly curated, heavily redacted stack of internal documents to a prominent business columnist he regularly played golf with. By Wednesday morning, a massive article ran on the front page of the county business journal. The headline practically screamed that a bitter, petty family feud was holding the local housing economy hostage. Grant had masterfully framed Blue Haven Rebuild not as a hard-working, honest local firm, but as a group of desperate opportunists attempting to extort a respected legacy developer. He spun a public narrative that I was leveraging a minor, arbitrarily inherited strip of dirt to squeeze millions of dollars out of my own parents, completely ignoring the catastrophic engineering fraud buried beneath his luxury project. Suddenly, my name was circulating through the city like a virus. To the general public, I was no longer the unfairly discarded daughter. I was the selfish, vindictive woman actively threatening the livelihood of hundreds of local contractors and recklessly endangering the municipal housing market. The most painful, sickening part of their media strategy was how they twisted the truth about the vulnerable neighborhood downhill from Crown Vale Preserve. Grant's strategic leak suggested that Beckett's Signature Communities was desperately trying to finalize the upper project to ensure immediate structural safety for those innocent buyers below. He boldly claimed that my petty refusal to grant the easement was the sole reason those working-class families were currently in danger. They were using the very people I was trying to protect as human shields to force my surrender. The pressure was suffocating, threatening to crush the life out of our small company. But Naomi Voss did not flinch for a single second. She immediately went on the offensive, building a massive legal fortress around Evelyn's deed. She ruthlessly subpoenaed my grandmother's comprehensive medical records, securing sworn, airtight affidavits from 3 independent geriatric specialists who explicitly confirmed that Evelyn Mercer possessed a razor-sharp, completely unimpaired mental acuity right up until her final hours. Naomi prepared a devastating defense strategy, but she firmly warned me that the Beckett's overwhelming financial influence over the local judiciary still made the fight incredibly dangerous. If my father managed to leverage his political capital to get a sympathetic judge assigned to the emergency hearing, the documented facts might not matter at all. We needed overwhelming, undeniable proof of my family's corruption, and Mason provided the heavy artillery. While Naomi fought in the sterile legal trenches, my husband vanished into the gritty, undocumented archives of the local construction industry. He reached out to his old framing crews, retired site foremen, and the disgruntled subcontractors my brother had unceremoniously fired over the past 4 years. Working late into the night, Mason meticulously tracked down a staggering trove of buried evidence. He secured archived job site photographs from personal cell phones showing the massive, terrifying fissures in the shale that Grant had explicitly ordered covered up with loose dirt. He pulled cross-referenced weather logs from the national database, proving the official development timelines submitted to the city were entirely fabricated. Most crucially, he obtained a series of time-stamped text messages and printed internal inspection memos from Carter and 2 other field supervisors. The documentation proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that severe, catastrophic field warnings regarding the volatile clay were actively and maliciously suppressed during the initial grading phase of the luxury project. Then, we caught the miraculous break that permanently shattered my father's entire legal strategy. A retired county recording clerk named Arthur Pendleton read the slanderous Business Journal article over his morning coffee and immediately contacted Naomi's office. Arthur had been the senior clerk on duty the specific afternoon Evelyn filed the irrevocable deed transfer. He was absolutely furious at the lies being told, and he eagerly agreed to provide a sworn, on-the-record deposition. Sitting in Naomi's conference room, staring directly into the camera recording the deposition, Arthur confirmed that my grandmother had marched into the county records office entirely alone, completely lucid, and fiercely determined. He testified under oath that Evelyn personally insisted on expediting the land transfer, explicitly telling him that I was the absolute only Beckett she trusted to do the decent thing when the inevitable, blinding greed finally took over the family business. Arthur's testimony completely destroyed the legal accusation of undue influence, but the final, most profound emotional blow came from inside my own family's vault. During the aggressive discovery phase of the civil lawsuit, Naomi filed a sweeping, uncompromising motion compelling the Becketts to produce all written communications related to Evelyn Mercer's estate. My parents' attorneys fought the subpoena fiercely, stalling the process for over 14 days, which only confirmed to Naomi that they were desperately hiding something significant. When the presiding judge finally threatened Edward with contempt of court and severe financial sanctions, they reluctantly handed over a thin, unremarkable manila folder. Naomi called me into her office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The heavy, bruised gray sky outside her large window matched the cold, sinking feeling in my chest. Sitting perfectly centered on her glass desk was a single, aged envelope. It was sealed with dark crimson wax and addressed to me in my grandmother's unmistakable, elegant handwriting. "Your mother had this locked inside a personal wall safe for over 3 years," Naomi said softly, her voice thick with a barely suppressed, violent anger. "Evelyn entrusted this exact letter to Lorraine with explicit, written instructions to deliver it directly to you the day after the funeral. Lorraine hid it instead." My hands trembled violently as I picked up the envelope. I carefully snapped the old wax seal and unfolded the thick, cream-colored stationery. Reading the ink on the page felt like hearing my grandmother's steady, quiet voice speaking directly from the grave, effortlessly cutting through all the polished lies my parents had spent years spinning. In the letter, Evelyn did not offer gentle, comforting platitudes. She wrote with the sharp, devastating clarity of a woman who knew exactly what kind of monster her son had truly become. She detailed her long-standing, quiet horror at Edward's ruthless expansion tactics and Grant's reckless, deeply dangerous shortcuts. She freely admitted that she had quietly purchased the narrow ridge parcel through a blind trust the very moment she saw the preliminary land surveys for Crown Vale Preserve, knowing full well the mountain was inherently unstable and unsuitable for heavy development. Evelyn stated clearly, in dark ink that had barely faded, that the land was never meant to be a simple financial inheritance. It was a calculated, strategic roadblock designed to break a tyrant. She left the property exclusively to me because she knew I possessed the exact moral spine my father entirely lacked. She wrote that the critical land was left in my name so that one day, when Edward's blinding obsession with his own legacy inevitably threatened to destroy innocent lives, I would have the absolute, unassailable legal authority to stand firmly in his way and stop him. Lorraine had hidden the letter because it was the ultimate, irrefutable proof that I was never the selfish villain of this story. I was the failsafe. My grandmother had turned her own wealth into a shield to protect the public from her own blood, and she had chosen me to finally set it into motion. The first week of January brought a relentless, punishing rain that fundamentally changed the nature of our war. It was not a typical winter storm that blows through in a matter of hours. It was a torrential, blinding deluge that lasted for 7 straight days, completely saturating the already compromised, fractured shale of the eastern ridge. What had been a purely legal and financial battle contained within manicured law offices and country club dining rooms suddenly transformed into a terrifying, physical reality. I did not wait for the news anchors to report on the damage. On the 4th morning of the downpour, I put on my heavy work boots, grabbed a waterproof jacket, and drove my battered truck down to the working-class subdivision situated directly beneath Crown Vale Preserve. I parked at the end of a cul-de-sac and walked through the driving rain toward the chain-link fences that marked the property lines. What I saw made my blood run entirely cold. The steep hillside looming above the neighborhood was no longer holding its shape. Thick, dark rivers of liquefied mud and debris were aggressively carving deep ravines into the slope, bypassing the inadequate silt fences my brother's excavation crews had hastily installed months ago. The runoff was already pooling violently against the back patios of several modest, single-story homes. I stood in the freezing rain and watched a young mother desperately trying to stack sandbags against her sliding glass door, while two small children watched from the kitchen window. She was terrified. This was not a theoretical risk on a topographical map. These were ordinary people, families who had spent decades paying off their mortgages, completely unaware that a billionaire developer was gambling with their lives just hundreds of feet above their heads. If I maintained my absolute, rigid refusal to sign anything, the entire slope system would inevitably fail by the spring. The resulting mudslide would annihilate those houses. My father's empire would collapse, yes. He would be destroyed, publicly disgraced, and likely indicted. That would be the simplest, most absolute form of revenge. But standing there in the mud, watching that mother struggle with the sandbags, I felt a profound, sharp clarity slice through my lingering anger. If I allowed innocent people to lose everything just to ensure Edward Beckett suffered the maximum possible ruin, I would become the exact thing I despised. I would be treating human beings as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of my own personal victory. I would be my father's daughter. I drove straight from the flooded neighborhood to Naomi's office in the commercial district. I walked into her glass-walled conference room, leaving muddy footprints on her pristine carpet, and told her we were changing the entire strategy. We were no longer simply playing defense. I am not going to let that mountain fall on those people, I told Naomi, stripping off my wet jacket. But I am absolutely not going to sign the permanent easement my father needs to save his company. We are going to split the battlefield right down the middle. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with intense, focused interest. Within 2 hours, she had a senior forensic structural engineer sitting at the table with us. We spread the county topographical maps across the glass and went to work designing a legal and physical trap. I asked the engineer exactly what it would take to permanently secure the hillside and divert the water safely away from the neighborhood below, without ever allowing the upper luxury lots to be developed. He calculated the metrics, factoring in the volatile clay and the fractured shale. He told us that heavy crews would need to drive 30-foot steel pilings deep into the bedrock and construct a massive, reinforced concrete retaining wall across the lower boundary. They need access through your ridge parcel to get the heavy cranes and concrete trucks into position, the engineer explained, tracing a path with his pen. But the moment that retaining wall is finished, the upper acreage becomes entirely landlocked and permanently inaccessible for commercial use. You can save the neighborhood, but the luxury development dies on the vine. Draft it, I told Naomi. We spent the next 48 hours crafting a brilliantly narrow, highly restricted legal instrument known as a limited temporary access order. It was a masterpiece of strategic restraint. The document would grant emergency crews and municipal utility vehicles the right to cross my property for exactly 90 days. The authorization was strictly limited to public safety stabilization efforts. It explicitly prohibited any commercial construction, explicitly banned Beckett signature communities from resuming their luxury development, and contained zero provisions that would satisfy the massive, frozen commercial loans my father so desperately needed to unfreeze. It was a surgical strike. It protected the innocent families and safeguarded the municipal utility corridors, but it absolutely denied my parents the financial rescue they were demanding. It stripped them of their wealth and their reputation, while simultaneously saving the public from their catastrophic negligence. When I brought the finalized draft back to the farmhouse, Mason read through the thick stack of pages in silence. The heavy winter rain battered against our kitchen windows, a constant reminder of the ticking clock outside. Mason set the document down on the soapstone counter and looked at me, his dark eyes entirely serious. "This is brilliant, Allison," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "But you need to understand something. Edward and Lorraine would rather you burn the entire city to the ground than do this. If you outright refuse to help, they can play the victims. They can blame you for the collapse. But if you step in and save the neighborhood while deliberately locking them out of their own profits, they will hate you with a ferocity you have never seen. You are denying them their money while simultaneously taking away their ability to play the martyr." I reached across the counter and rested my hand over his rough knuckles. That is exactly the point, I answered quietly. I refuse to be cruel like them, but I also absolutely refuse to let them turn my mercy into a shield for their fraud. They wanted me to be their savior. Instead, I am going to be their warden. I spent the final days before the emergency civil hearing preparing with intense, cold precision. I isolated my emotions entirely, viewing the upcoming courtroom battle not as a family dispute, but as a hostile corporate dismantling. I set 3 non-negotiable goals for myself. First, I would fiercely defend the absolute legality of Evelyn's deed transfer, proving my grandmother was a visionary, not a victim. Second, I would orchestrate the undeniable public exposure of my brother's reckless cover-up and my father's complicit fraud. Third, and most importantly, I would offer the presiding judge only the absolute minimum relief necessary to protect the innocent people living at the bottom of the hill. The social circles of Ashbrook were buzzing with rumors that the pressure was finally getting to me. The local gossip columns hinted that the exiled daughter was cracking under the weight of the municipal emergency. Through the tight-knit network of local contractors, Mason heard that my father was walking around the corporate headquarters with a renewed, arrogant swagger. Edward had caught wind from a terrified junior clerk at the courthouse that Naomi Voss was officially drafting access authorization documents regarding the disputed Ridge parcel. My father heard the word access and immediately assumed he had won. He assumed that the public smearing, the brutal legal threats, and the overwhelming financial pressure had finally broken my spirit. He truly believed that I was softening, that I was preparing to surrender my land and sign his permanent easement just to make the nightmare end. Edward Beckett thought I was quietly preparing a white flag. He was entirely blissfully unaware that I was actually loading the single most devastating, perfectly controlled weapon of the entire war. The Rutherford County Municipal Chamber was built to hold 200 people, but by 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, there were easily 300 bodies crammed into the humid, wood-paneled room. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool coats, cheap courthouse coffee, and electric anxiety. Half the room consisted of terrified homeowners from the lower subdivision, clutching damp tissues and staring at the presiding county commissioner with desperate eyes. The other half was a sea of dark, expensive suits my father's corporate attorneys, the anxious representatives from the primary lending institutions, and a swarm of local journalists hungry for blood. My family sat at the primary petitioner's table. Edward wore a bespoke navy suit, projecting an aura of absolute unbothered command. Lorraine sat beside him, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the devastated matriarch to perfection. Grant slouched slightly, exuding a practiced, arrogant boredom. The moment the gavel fell, my father's lead litigator launched a ferocious, theatrical assault. He paced across the worn carpet, pointing a manicured finger at me where I sat next to Naomi and Mason. He painted a masterpiece of character assassination. He told the chamber that I was a bitter, estranged daughter who harbored a deep, vindictive resentment because my parents had simply expressed loving concern over my sudden, ill-advised marriage. He claimed I was actively holding an entire community hostage, leveraging a meaningless family dispute to extract millions of dollars in an extortion scheme. Lorraine was called to speak next. She stood before the microphone, her voice trembling with a flawless, heartbreaking vibrato. She did not speak about soil or easements. She spoke entirely about broken family bonds. She looked directly at the reporters and pleaded for me to put my selfish pride aside and save the innocent families below the development. Grant followed her performance, boldly insisting under oath that the catastrophic geological risks were entirely unforeseeable, an unpredictable act of nature that his brilliant engineering team was now desperately trying to mitigate. They built a beautiful, towering wall of lies. Then, Naomi Voss stood up and took a sledgehammer to the foundation. Naomi did not raise her voice. She operated with the cold, terrifying precision of a surgeon. She systematically introduced the sworn medical affidavits from the 3 independent geriatric specialists, instantly vaporizing the claim that Evelyn Mercer was mentally unfit. She entered the retired clerk's deposition into the official county record, proving the deed transfer was a deliberate, isolated act. Then, Naomi introduced Evelyn's notarized letter. She read my grandmother's words aloud to the packed chamber. The room went dead silent. The devastating clarity of Evelyn's warning echoed off the high ceiling, explicitly outlining my father's greed and confirming that the land was given to me specifically to prevent this exact catastrophe. The narrative of the bitter, extorting daughter evaporated in an instant, replaced by the undeniable reality of a grandmother's desperate fail-safe. But a letter from the dead was not enough to secure a fraud investigation. For that, we needed the living. Mason was called to the witness stand. My father's attorneys sneered openly, entirely prepared to dissect a blue-collar laborer. They fundamentally misunderstood the man sitting before them. Mason did not flinch under their rapid-fire objections, speaking with a profound, immovable calm. He opened a thick, worn leather binder. He produced the archived, time-stamped weather logs from the initial grading phase. He submitted the high-resolution photographs showing massive, jagged fissures tearing through the volatile clay, images taken months before the engineering addendum was ever filed. He handed the bailiff a stack of printed, internal field notes detailing his exact verbal warnings to Grant, warnings that had been entirely scrubbed from the official Beckett Signature Community servers. The dirt was screaming at them, Mason testified, his deep voice carrying flawlessly to the back rows of the gallery. You do not bring deep soil stabilizers onto a site if you think you are digging into solid bedrock. They knew the mountain was moving. They chose to build the houses anyway. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The lending representatives in the back row suddenly stopped taking notes and began frantically texting on their phones. Panicked, Edward's legal team aggressively recalled Carter, the fired superintendent, hoping to discredit Mason's timeline. It was a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. Carter took the stand sweating profusely, his hands trembling. Naomi stepped up to cross-examine him. She did not attack him. She cornered him with the sheer weight of the perjury statutes. Under the crushing pressure of federal fraud implications, the veteran superintendent broke completely. Carter corroborated every single word of Mason's testimony. He confessed, his voice cracking, that Grant had explicitly ordered the crews to backfill the dangerous fissures with loose dirt and cover them with tarps to hide the structural failure from the New York investors. The entire chamber gasped. Grant's face drained of all color, his arrogant slouch instantly turning into a rigid posture of pure panic. But Carter was not finished. Grant was reckless, Carter stammered, pointing a shaking finger directly at the Beckett table. But he was terrified. He only gave the order because Edward Beckett stood on that hillside, looked me in the eye, and told me that the construction schedule had to be protected at any cost. He said we would patch the mountain later. He ordered the cover-up. Edward lunged forward in his heavy wooden chair, his face flushed purple with rage. But his attorneys aggressively pulled him back down. It was too late. The absolute truth was out in the open, bleeding onto the municipal floor. The presiding county commissioner stared at my father with a look of profound, chilling disgust. The officials suddenly realized the horrifying reality. The Beckett family was not desperately trying to secure my land to save the terrified homeowners sitting in the gallery. They were trying to secure my signature to unlock their frozen loan money, finish the luxury development, and escape their catastrophic civil liability before the mountain collapsed. They were using human lives as leverage for a corporate bailout. The commissioner turned to me. The heavy silence in the room was deafening. It was time for my final move. I stood up from the petitioner's table. I did not look at my mother, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I did not look at my trembling brother. I looked directly at Edward Beckett. I will not grant the permanent easement, I stated clearly, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. I will never sign the document that allows Beckett Signature Communities to unlock their commercial funding or resume their luxury development on that mountain. That project is a monument to fraud, and it ends today. A collective, panicked murmur rippled through the banking executives. My father looked as if I had just driven a stake through his chest. However, I continued, turning to face the gallery of terrified homeowners, ensuring they heard every single word, I am submitting a tightly limited, 90-day emergency access authorization to the court. This authorization grants immediate, unfettered access across my property strictly for municipal engineering crews and public safety vehicles. It is granted solely for the purpose of driving steel pilings into the bedrock and constructing a massive, permanent retaining wall to divert the runoff and permanently stabilize the lower neighborhood. I turned back to the commissioner, placing the drafted document on his raised desk. This order protects the citizens of this county, I declared. It completely blocks the Becketts from ever reviving their dangerous expansion, and it ensures they cannot profit from the disaster they deliberately created. I had stripped them of everything. I took away their land, I took away their money, and I completely eradicated the false moral high ground they had planned to use to destroy my reputation. I saved the innocent families, and in doing so, I locked my family in a prison of their own making. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. The court officially upheld Evelyn's deed, cementing my absolute ownership of the ridge. The representatives from the lending institutions stood up in unison and walked out of the double doors, immediately freezing all capital to Beckett signature communities. Before we even cleared the courthouse steps, a representative from the State Attorney General's office announced the immediate opening of a comprehensive criminal fraud investigation into the company's internal compliance culture. Through the chaotic swarm of reporters and cheering homeowners, I caught sight of Edward standing near the defense table. His empire was burning to ashes around him. He looked at me across the crowded room, his eyes hollow and utterly defeated. He finally understood the magnitude of his failure. The daughter he had so easily dismissed, the woman he thought was too soft for the brutal world of business, had completely destroyed him. And the most agonizing, unbearable part of his defeat was the realization that I had beaten him without ever having to become him. The aftermath of the hearing did not unfold over a few dramatic days. It was a slow, agonizing dismantling that took exactly 8 months of grueling court supervision. Crown Vale Preserve, the shining jewel of my father's empire, was systematically broken apart by municipal decree. The dangerous, speculative luxury expansion on the upper ridge was permanently halted, the land effectively condemned for commercial use. The lower sections, the areas critical to the survival of the neighborhood below, were turned over to a state-appointed receiver. Grant did not escape the avalanche he helped start. When the State Attorney General opened the official fraud investigation, the digital paper trail led directly to his desk. He is currently facing multiple federal indictments for falsified reporting and wire fraud, staring down the very real possibility of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His arrogant sneer has been completely wiped away, replaced by the terrified realization that his father's money can no longer buy his freedom or silence his accusers. But the deepest, most absolute public disgrace fell entirely on Edward Beckett, the man who had spent 40 years building a dynasty, obsessed with his own legacy and his own brilliance, had ultimately destroyed the very empire he claimed to protect. The primary lending bank seized his remaining commercial assets. The society pages that used to celebrate his philanthropy now printed detailed, highly sourced accounts of his negligence. He was forced to resign from every corporate board, every charity committee, and every country club in Ashbrook. Lorraine lost the only thing she truly valued, her social certainty and public control. Stripped of her power, the society wives who used to hang on her every word suddenly stopped returning her calls. They treated the Beckett name like an infectious disease. In her desperate, quiet isolation, she tried one last time to reach me. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she called my private cell phone. Her voice was thin, fragile, and entirely stripped of its usual commanding vibrato. She did not demand anything. She simply wept quietly and asked whether there was still, after everything that had happened in the courtroom, a way back to family. I agreed to meet my parents one final time. However, I absolutely refused to step foot inside that suffocating mansion ever again. I told them to come to the Blue Haven Rebuild headquarters. Our office was not a sprawling, glass-walled corporate fortress surrounded by manicured lawns. It was a modest, converted brick warehouse on the industrial side of town. The wooden floors were scuffed from heavy work boots. The air smelled of fresh pine lumber and strong black coffee, and the walls were lined with honest blueprints that actually matched the dirt we built on. It was a physical, breathing testament to the 5 hard years they never bothered to witness. Edward and Lorraine walked through our glass front door looking like hollow ghosts. My father wore a tailored suit that suddenly seemed 2 sizes too large for his shrinking, defeated frame. My mother clutched her designer handbag against her chest as if it were a life preserver in a stormy sea. Mason stood quietly by the drafting tables in the back of the room, a silent, immovable guardian, giving me the space to finish this war entirely on my own terms. They sat across from me at my battered wooden desk. Even then, sitting in the ashes of his ruined life, Edward tried to salvage his pride. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon the ghost of his former corporate authority. "Allison," he began, his voice hoarse and trembling slightly. Things escalated beyond anyone's control. The market pressures from New York were immense. What happened with the engineering reports? It was simply a series of aggressive business decisions that got out of hand, a severe miscalculation of risk. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy pity. "Do not do that," I told him, my voice completely steady and ringing with finality. "Do not sit in my office and try to hide your cruelty behind the shield of professionalism. Ordering men to bury a fractured mountain so you could defraud your investors is not a business miscalculation. It is a crime. And throwing your daughter out into the freezing street because you could not control her husband was not a corporate restructuring. It was an act of pure, calculated malice." Lorraine reached across the scarred desk, her hands shaking violently. "We were trying to protect you," she pleaded, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "We were trying to protect the legacy for you and your brother. Please, Allison, we have lost absolutely everything. We need you." "You do not need me," I corrected her, pulling my hands back just out of her reach. "You need a savior. You came to me because you thought the one thing only I could give was a legal signature on a piece of paper. You thought my name on a deed was the master key to your salvation. But you were fundamentally wrong." I leaned forward, making sure they heard and felt every single word of my final verdict. The one thing only I could give you was my trust. It was my credibility. It was the chance to be treated as a human being, as a loyal daughter, long before I ever became legally useful to your bottom line. But you threw that away 5 years ago at a dinner party. You chose your pride over my life. So when the time finally came, I gave exactly what the innocent people in this county needed. I gave them safety. I gave them the unvarnished truth. And I gave you absolutely nothing that would help you escape the consequences of your own actions. My father closed his eyes, a profound, agonizing realization washing over his aged face. He finally understood that the ledger was permanently closed. There was zero negotiation left. They stood up, fragile and entirely defeated, and walked out of the office they had never helped build, stepping back into a city that no longer belonged to them. In the months that followed the collapse of Beckett's signature communities, Ashbrook began to heal. The municipal government officially seized the dangerous slopes of the Eastern Ridge and opened the massive stabilization project to public bidding. Blue Haven Rebuild did not win the contract because of my last name. We won it because we were the absolute only firm in the county with a proven, unassailable record of complete honesty, financial transparency, and superior craftsmanship. We were awarded a massive, multi-year municipal contract to restore the affected homes and permanently secure the damaged properties. It allowed Mason and me to expand our company entirely on our own terms. We hired 4 new crews, purchased our own heavy excavation equipment, and began doing the honest work my father should have done in the very beginning. We rebuilt the community, not as a monument to our own wealth, but as a genuine, lasting shelter for the people who lived there. the bitter, freezing cold of winter eventually gave way to a bright, clear spring. It is exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. I am standing beside Mason on a sprawling job site at the base of the eastern ridge. The rising sun is casting a brilliant, warm, golden light over the valley, burning away the lingering morning mist. The cool air is filled with the loud, rhythmic thrum of heavy diesel engines and the sharp shouts of our foreman coordinating the morning shift. I watch as 3 massive cement trucks back up to the freshly dug trenches. I watch the heavy gray sludge pour down the steel chutes, filling the reinforced frames that will hold back the mountain and protect the neighborhood forever. I remember the mocking, arrogant words my father spoke at that engagement dinner so many years ago. He told a room full of wealthy elites that my husband poured concrete for other people's dreams because he could not build his own. He was entirely wrong about that, just like he was wrong about everything else. Mason and I built our dream from the absolute bottom up, using the very dirt they tried to bury us in. My family wanted my obedience back. They demanded my submission to save their artificial empire. But what I gave them instead was pure, unadulterated justice. And standing here in the dawn light, watching my husband build a foundation that will actually hold, I know with absolute certainty that the justice I delivered hurt them far more than my obedience ever could have saved them. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Where are you listening from? Please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts with us. Remember to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.